The Illuminator. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans to prosper you and not to harm you. Plans to give you hope and a future. Jeremiah chapter 29, verse 11. In worlds so far apart, cultures appear strangely familiar to one another. And this fact brought about countless questions to scholars, soldiers, and everyday people the world over. We could explain parts of it with conscience and philosophy of civilizations that have come and gone before us, being a baseline for the next one to grow from the former's collapse. But what if there is truth to it all? That every myth, every superstition has at one point in the insurmountable time this reality has existed, occurred, once, maybe even twice. The next, more simplified question to everything we choose to believe and do with our lives is why. Such a simple word, carrying so many implications to it, has rarely been contested in our vocabularies. So why is it we choose to believe? Why do we choose the paths set before us? Why choose at all? And then that leads you to the next question. What for? The answer is simple, and yet so controversial, to the point we can split families, nations, and entire worlds apart over it. We do it because anything else would be what we gave the name to house our worst fears, doubts, and thoughts. Hell. Look around to the world at large and tell yourself hell isn't real. And if you said yes, ask yourself why is it so difficult to imagine its opposite. But to you and me, heaven could be an entirely different place. But we both will say it'll be a place for all to be happy. And yet we'll exclude those that see it differently, casting them to the fire, not entirely benevolent if we tried. So, we head to another world. That was once a heaven to its defenders, turned to hell by those that seek to transform it to their own version of paradise. Down on the ash-covered wastelands, surrounding the capital city of this once flourishing world, the fallout falls from the sky as rotten snowflakes. Nuclear winter had set in from the war that brought this world to the grave. Now all that remains is who will be the rulers of the cemetery they've built. Like many that have come before them, they preached peace and unity under a single banner. But they were, as always, two different banners. Same message, just different coloured flags. None of that mattered now. Now comes the slaughter, the Armageddon, the battle built of the rage and regrets of all who have survived to this point, that were so outraged by their failure to achieve that wondrous dream that all they wish now is for it all to burn away, undeserving of a second chance. They never wanted this. They would tell themselves that it was all the other's fault. But trust, alliances, and peace is a two-way system. Were they so dedicated to the idea, it would have been done in a day. But even in hindsight, it's disgustingly naive. In repetition of past events, both armies took their places opposite one another. The defenders wisely chose to stay in the fortified battlements of their city walls, metaphorically as thick as their skulls, and too dense to let anything through. They would be protected well. They stood as high as their ambition, almost piercing the clouds above. They gained a bird's-eye view of the trenches and craters of the open space around. Anyone foolish enough to attack would be mostly exposed and helpless. But tactics were as gone as the dust and echoes of the lost souls taken by their war, and the attackers rode forth on steeds of steel and platforms of weaponry so packed together not even the operator's spit would reach the floor beneath. The pale-skinned attackers brought about their anger in a thunderous war cry that shook the ground more viciously than the artillery shells that silenced them. Volley after volley, the blank canvas of the fields were painted in red and other pigments of bodily fluids and filling the craters around it. It would be death by drowning and shelling. Just death. On the walls, the defenders shouted for those above the crowds to witness their actions, to reward them with the ascension that was promised to them decades ago, that this be the time they would join the stars in glorious harmony. To whatever end they were wishing, the stars were quiet. Meanwhile, down below on the killing fields, a similar prayer was proposed to the same ones above, to give them the courage and strength to bring down the walls in front or die trying. However, one of the prayers was answered. As the shadowed sky lit up with a thunderous crack heralding a falling star that blinded those that looked at it directly, it came hurling between the lines of each army and crashed into the ashes, scattering them to the winds it caused in a similar fashion to a blizzard. When it cleared, those who gazed upon what was at its epicenter threw their weapons to the ground and bowed in reverence. Both sides couldn't bring themselves to carry on their hate in the presence of something so bright and beautiful. At the ground around the feet of the shimmering figure, flowers, long known to be extinct as a result of this war, began to grow and blossom right in front of their eyes. Children, who never knew the colour green, were now saturated and enveloped by its natural purity. At the centre of it all was an exquisitely muscular, red-skinned, tri-horned figure, adorned in pearl-white armour and the most grand gold trimmings that held purple gems so flawless each one could build an empire off their worth. He stood tall and proud, gazing at the landscape around, a huge sword on his back and a banner to his side, bearing the symbol of a golden hand reaching out to golden stars, and a reinforced book clasped to its belt, bearing a similar icon, with the addition of another hand, golden in prayer, with the other and the words, "The Truth of Faith," inscribed upon it. He observed ever vigilantly his surroundings, seeing the cowering, the hopeful and the relieved, treading towards the open fields littered with those that attacked the city, with the greenery following him in his wake. Even the wounds suffered by the soldiers miraculously healed within seconds of his presence. He brought out his arms wide and bellowed to all, "Rejoice, ever faithful! Your promised absolution has come, brought forth by my illuminating grace." The light behind his head intensified, turning night to day for miles. Those nearby averted their eyes, but to a delight their vision was not harmed, but enhanced. They all looked to this man, paralyzed by his majesty. From inside the city's cries of joy, from the inevitable liberation, came from all that could muster their voices, and from the fields an identical serenade joined them. One man, adorned in a uniform of nobility, cried out to the radiant figure, Who would bless us with such a presence after all we've done?" The light began to calm to just a lingering pyre from the figure, and he spoke to the man in a gentle voice that soothed the hearts of men, women, and children alike. "Eidolon the Illuminator, Eidolon turns towards the city's walls and looks across their breadth, eyes piercing the souls of those atop. He pointed to them all and addressed them like a disappointed master would speak to a pupil.
You have not the right to give me such praise, for you are of the flesh of the wicked. Your refusal to accept these down below only rewarded you with malice and rejection, to which, in your pride, brought about your self-righteous desire to rape, burn, and kill as you pleased. You thought you were above such reproach.
Eidolon's lights began to shine brighter once more. This time it began to sprout feather-like constructs that stroked the walls to the city. Wherever they went, the surface was bleached and ashen white, cleansed in its entirety. In a bid to appease him, the lord of the city rode out from the gates behind him, his company of elite guards, though while he stepped just outside the gates, with them closed just enough to let him back in. The guardsmen continued to stand just beneath a mound of rocks, which Eidolon walked atop of, looking down on them. This is what he wanted. As he smiled to their direction, his glistening teeth reflected the light around him, and the soldiers, despite being covered completely in white plated armor, trembled and rattled inside. With a megaphone, the Lord called out to him,
We were the rightful rulers of this world, and we kept praying for intervention unto this day. Why now and not before?
A smart question, given how easily it was for Eidolon to arrive. Why not earlier?
Skepticism leads to deceit. For how can you know what is truth if you must question it in the first place? Does your heart not tell you?
Keeping to his ways, the Lord replied with more ire in his voice than before.
I lost so much of this world, so much of my subjects, so much of my wealth and power, and now you come here telling me I am to be rewarded? With what? What reward can replace all that I have lost?
Disgusted, Eidolon merely shook his head.
You mentioned yourself, and never those you claimed lordship over.
He stares down to the hill's still trembling guards, then to the city's walls at large, that became more populated by the second.
Why not what they have lost? Why not what these around me? Why only you? And that is why I am here, to reward those that have lost. You are not one of them.
Eidolon holds his hand open to the sky, glistening with runes and fire.
Behold my faithful, my illumination!
A beam of light encompassed Eidolon and soared to the skies above, breaking apart into tens of thousands of smaller streaks that sporadically darted in every direction perceivable. Like a chandelier, it brought light to the night side of the planet, and from the ships in orbit, marked with the Orion's faithful symbol, they observed in joyous reverence to the divine power on display. Before descending, like an angelic host to those below, parting clouds, rivers, and trees as they landed. The ramps of their hatches and hangars and all opened, revealing all manner of humanoids marched in rhythm, escorted by beasts, vehicles, and giants like the Gerahene lords dressed in robes. Eidolon turned to the king and pointed to him, then proposed an ultimatum.
He and those around him had brought all this chaos among you, those that still proclaim loyalty to him. that think he'll grant you rewards everlasting. Then protect him.
He takes up his sword, curved at the tip like a shovel, with runes gilding the centre of the blade as wide as his arms.
From me!
None dared. Everyone backed away with plenty of haste. Some even fell over themselves, scattering behind the debris, and merely peeking over to see if anyone was foolish enough. The Lord's guards fled the fastest and most desperate. Nearing their master, they are horrified by the gates closing behind him. They clash with the door, shouting to be let in. Drawing their attention to the battlements above, the Lord stands next to the lever of a booby-trap designed to kill any who try to breach the gate.
Get out, cowards, and do your sworn duty!
The ultimatum: to die at the hands of Eidolon or their lord. Perhaps their bravery would be appreciated more if they charged the mightier foe than dying like fleeing cowards. In their hysteria, they turned and charged to Eidolon, who stood awaiting their challenge. They drew their swords and swung. The blades shattered like glass upon contact. They drew everything they had, and all for naught. They proceeded to use their fist. Some broke fingers on their first strike, but Eidolon just stood until they all ran out of breath and energy. The Illuminator looked up at the Lord and scoffed, holding his hand out to the guards that began to glow. Suddenly, their fatigue was gone, feeling better than they've ever felt before. In a flash of light, Eidolon was on top of the wall, stood in front of the Lord, holding him up by his head in the same manner you would hold a golf ball. Despite him being 10 foot tall, the head of his scrawny, miserable excuse for a noble was merely an ant. A spiteful, unworthy ant in comparison. He held the Lord over the edge and spoke to all around.
He would so willingly throw your lives away to keep all that he has robbed from you all. Food, money, influence and security.
The armies of the faithful began to be within visual range of the city. From one side of the horizon to the other, they numbered in the hundreds of thousands.
But under my banner, the banner of the faithful, serving my God Emperor Melitian, blessed above all, you'll have all of that and more. All you must do is praise the Orion Empire, praise the Emperor, praise his most devoted, me.
Nothing more needed had to be said. The subjugation and memories of all that endured such horrors of war and slavery by the hands of the Lord did the rest of the convincing. Both the citizens, soldiers, and attackers of the city all dropped to their knees and cheered in relief for their salvation, brought on by the Orion's faithful, with their devotee supreme, Eidolon the Illuminator, lighting the way. Eidolon hurled the Lord with strength akin to myth. So easily the Lord was flung away, his frail frame was witness to clear the miles that made up the plains. Gaining in speed, a sonic boom came from his direction. Everyone gazed as he continued to fly over the edge of the horizon, until not even the telescope and binoculars could see him clearly. With a gesture of his arm, the gates opened to the joyous relief of everyone around. It was fantastical. Friend and foe, who were minutes ago shedding their blood, sweating tears all over the land that looked so insignificant in comparison to what was held before them now. Over in the skies above, aircraft soared like swarms of birds in formation and mesmerizing the spectators. Eidolon, with his task of unifying this dying world completed, turns to the crowds that gather around him, offering both thanks and gifts, being escorted to the palace. About an hour had passed. It's hard to guess considering the world's rotation wasn't fully remembered by the Orions just yet. Eidolon was sat at a round table in the monumental throne room of the once lord of this world, around were various Taesh, Yorbrail, and Inajar, alongside other auxiliary species to the Orion Empire, though all were dressed in marble white armour and gold trimmings, following the colour scheme of their leader. Some wore full-bodied robes held by golden chains adorned with jewels. Accompanying them were the former Lord's guards, 6 of them, who were in the process of removing their armour, revealing robes like those worn by the Orions to be hidden underneath. One even commenting, "They're glad to have the armour off, as wearing the extra layers were hot as a volcano." Eidolon led an applause for the agents, congratulating them as they played their deception well, infiltrating, assassinating, and replacing the royal guards, whose identities were kept secret and entirely covered, all the easier to trick those around them. Entering from a shadowed hallway that led to an underground cavern, a frail man had walked bearing familiar clothing. It was the Lord from before. But how? How could he have survived being thrown like that? It's impossible. To those who wouldn't know the truth. As he removed his own robes and imprinted face mask, a pressure suit was shown, and his ears, which were also false, had been implanted with noise suppressors. After all was revealed, it was an elderly Taesh, who in his frailty had a hunched back, perfect for impersonating the once deranged planetary lord. The old man giggled like a toddler, expressing the joy he felt when he was hurled as fast as a fighter jet, bringing back thrills he had in his prime, which Eidolon cheerfully laughed along with, and beckoned him to take a seat, and offered a hot beverage for him, and putting on the signature goggles that helped Taesh see in the light. Everyone present sat around the table. A dozen was stood around each of the 20 chairs, aiming to look at the projections forming at the centre by a holographic projector hovering above. A meeting to determine how the world would be overseen by the faithful. Building hospitals to treat for the inevitable radiation and related illnesses was first priority. Reinforcing barricades, towns, and major trade routes used by the planet's natives were secondary. There was very little, if any, resistance could muster to face them. Even the nukes they were provided only detonated because they were triggered manually by Eidolon himself. He made sure to do it at the time everyone wanted them to. The detonator, which he brandished, giving it to the elderly Taesh, who smiled in reverence to the applause of the onlookers. A new lord of the planet had received his insurance and political power. Just one button to silence those who in the future would begin to question the faith. Maybe not now, or a week, but eventually. Eidolon signalled 4 figures that were encased in the shadows behind him to approach. When the light of his halo shone onto them, all the guests took a few steps back in fear. Even the old man had curled slightly into his new throne. They were monstrous, to say the least. One was of the Yorbrail, one of the Taesh, and the others of the Inajar. But their musculature was void of any body fat, their veins bulging and pulsating with energetic arcs of golden energy. Flowing like blood, their skin was bleached as well. And their armour was a coloured dark grey, and trimmed with red. Eidolon turned to the old man. These were now his guardians. He thought it was overkill to have 4 of Eidolon's own task force, the Apostles. Eidolon reassured him. This was for the worst case scenarios. adding on that an apostle squadron resides on every world of the Orion faith. The Illuminator bid everyone farewell and wished them good luck in their efforts to transform this broken world into another jewel to be proud of. Around him, artificial wind blew a few pieces of paper around as energy whirled around him. Then Eidolon turned into a beam of light ascending through the ceiling of the throne room and into a hovering warship stationed over the city. Its size so massive it blocked out the sun for the entirety of the city itself and to the outpost outside its walls. The ship slowly fired up its engines and ascended vertically through the clouds, parting them on all sides, before abruptly accelerating to well past hypersonic speed straight into high orbit. Eidolon's duty for the day was done. He took the time earned in his private circular room on board his flagship known as Pasture of Serenity. A mighty vessel the likes the Empire and Faithful have barely seen the equal to, with the clear distinction being the Emperor's flagship. Being better, of course. Some of the corridors are measured in kilometres, though for Eidolon, his room was a blend of modesty and archaic. It had all the facilities befitting of someone of his role: bathroom with shower, a fully functional and freshly stocked kitchen, which he was currently cooking himself food, a soup of sorts, with brick oven baked bread, still steaming, extractor fans above to maintain temperature and to vacuum out unwanted smells, and steam that could damp the wooden chairs, and his own personal chaise lounge. At his right of the room, his armour was stood up on a mannequin modelled after his physique. To his left, an observational window projecting the backdrop to a planetary system, with a small note in its corner noting the word home. Eidolon pours the finished soup into a bowl firmly clasped in his hands, taking a few slices of bread and dipping the tips into the soup. With a voice command for the projector, the observation window turns black, and a small projector emerges from a hatch in the ceiling, lighting up the darkened window. A game of sports appears, a Borosian L-ball. Eidolon lays on his chaise lounge, kicking his feet up and leaning lazily back into the small pile of pillows, taking sips and spoonfuls of the soup and bites of the vegetables, laying the bowl down to a small table next to him, reaching for some fruit to peel its skin away, right before squeezing it above his open jaws, drinking the juices pouring from it, and throwing it behind his head, landing in the bin. Hours passed, enough for the Illuminator to have drifted into a slumber. Empty soup bowl, a few crumbs on his chest and mouth wide open, snoring. A small alarm clock wakes him, silencing it and rising briskly. After a shower and cleaning the dishes, Eidolon speaks a command for the ship's artificial intelligence to give him an update while he steadily put on his armour. The black screen ignites with a multitude of applications organised into categories corresponding to daily tasks, war efforts, messages from high-ranking officials, and other matters concerning someone of such high esteem. Being one of the Empire's high echelons and the devotee supreme of the faith, quiet and downtime is a rare commodity that is heavily respected and followed, allowing him time to sleep, eat, and recuperate his mental integrity. While reading some messages of prayer, he took his time to brush his teeth and polish his horns at a mahogany desk sporting a mirror for him. On the desktop were pictures of him standing with other generals of the Orion Empire during ceremonies and battle aftermaths. One picture that stood out from the rest included one of himself, at roughly his teenage years, opposite to what he is now. In this image, he was borderline emaciated, ragged clothes, and the backdrop of a wretched ruin of a once great city, though On the corner of this picture stood a figure with 4 arms, reaching out towards him with a blanket and food, accompanied by 3 wide war golems of crimson and gold. Finishing up his routine, he turns to the screen that now displays a priority mission, code word Die King, which robbed his attention from everything else. The message came from one of the newly converted, Geriheen Lord Balthazar, which Eidolon had a small, mounted picture of himself anointing him to the faith on the kitchen wall. Leaping over his furniture to the screen, he opens the message with a tap. The voice, recorded from Balthazar, played as followed.
My Illuminator Eidolon, I must apologize with my deepest regret. I am not ignorant to your time being under constant use for the benefit of our faith. I have to inform you of the return of our once greatest enemy. At first I was questioning the findings, but we've seen him, and we've already lost some to him, and Decimus is foolishly trying to contain him. It won't work, unless he sends me and the other 2. I beg of you to come. If we fail, then you're the only one who can stop him with certainty. Tiberius Sorin has returned like a cancer, and we must not let him spread across the galaxy. Not while our Emperor is preoccupied in expelling the accursed blight at our galaxy's core once again. Go forth with the strength and faith. The stars are ours by conviction, the lives of the faithless ours to take. The minutes following the message had filled the air with a cold sense of unease. One of the worst times for such a threat to arise, considering the Emperor himself was currently occupied with a task only the likes of him could complete, sealing off an incursion in the centre of the galaxy and repelling its herald back to whence it came. Balthazar's words spoke true, and with a sense of urgency never heard before from a Denajar Geriheen Lord. Eidolon paced around the room. He was charged by the Emperor to keep order within the Empire while he led the campaign of the Daijin Wars those decades ago. It was that time and service that gave Eidolon the title of Devotee Supreme and leadership of the newly founded Orion Faithful. And now, once again, duty, devotion, and piety has come to bring him into a new trial, a new set of destiny and fate that could see him becoming something even more than what he already is. The pressure was always there, but now it had squeezed his chest and planted its weight onto him. A man like Eidolon could only respond in one way, and that was the path to confrontation, a pilgrimage, a crusade. Though the time for contemplating was over, a knock at the door sprung him out of his train of thought. Darting towards the door, he opened it. It was his squire. A young man, just starting his 20s, and a couple feet shorter, red-skinned like Eidolon, with a couple of smaller horns and a distinctive shorter crest, adorned in a white uniform engraved with a chain of gold and silver wrapped around the shoulders. "Sir, your sermon is nigh. Need me to carry anything for you?" Looking back into his room, he picks up his banner and hands it to his squire. "Just that one, Sadush. Let's be on our way. Computer, lock the door."
Stepping out of his room, the door shuts and pressurized airlocks make it tight from any outside influence. Both take the route to their left, down a long corridor lined with bookcases, lanterns, and Gothic architecture. On the floor were different varieties of rugs and pelts. Their destination? The Grand Cathedral. Sadush carried his banner with both hands, too heavy for one, You wouldn't think at first, considering how easy Eidolon lifted it, using only his fingers. His gaze was angled down to the floor. His squire caught notice of the seemingly off mood of his master. "You seem to be troubled, my lord. Did you sleep well?" The question once again caused a jerk of the head to look back.
"I did, though the news I had woken up to has been a bit troublesome."
Sadouj nodded. In the 2 years of service, he learned to read the room wherever Eidolon went, in case he needed to secretly alert his master. Dissecting his own body language was a part of the job too. "It won't affect the sermon, will it? After all, the Emperor, blessed above all, has had to take his task again at the galaxy's core. The incursions have grown more frequent over the past years, I've heard. The last one was 15 years ago. Or is that the troubling news?" Eidolon shook his head.
"Not as severe, but it could become so if it isn't dealt with."
At the edge of the corridor lied a tram. Apart from the panel and benches to sit on, it had a screen for communicating to the ship, just in case the Illuminator had to make an emergency call or the tram got stuck. You never know. Both took a seat opposite to each other, while Sadouj placed the banner on a rack made just for it. Eidolon was fidgeting with his thumbs deep in thought. In his mind there were so many questions about every hypothetical. Answers, retorts, verses, an entire rehearsal going through his mind that is now needing to be edited at the last minute. Sadouj puts in a keycard, and the tram starts to make its way through the ship. Gaining speed along the way, the viewing windows provided a grand view of all the sections the tram passed through to make its way to the Grand Cathedral. The tram was high above the expansive spaces of the ship's interior. Below, the crew, soldiers, and workers appeared like ants. Numerous other lines for trams were visible, but Eidolon's was at the ceiling. Even a Gerahine Lord appeared to be small at this height, hundreds of feet in the air. Going through a large bay into another part of the ship, aircraft fly to landing pads on varying levels, some seeing the outside as the ship darts past specks of light, entire star systems. The tram then proceeded to dart to the left, further into the ship's centre point. Down below were seemingly legions of Orions, all wearing formal attire for their species, but all wore a cloak of white and gold, bearing the symbol of the faithful. Then, through another tunnel that separated the segments of the ship, emerged the visage of the Grand Cathedral. It was designed meticulously to mimic a feather. Grand arches of pure marble and glittered with rubies and other forms of rare gems shone in the ship's lighting. So grand was its size, its central spire was mere feet away from the segment's ceiling. Following up towards the cathedral bore a great runway for the people to gather at and make their way inside, adorned with the largest red carpet you could imagine. Though from the perspective of Eidolon and Sadouj, it was merely a swarm of people, who in their rhythm of passing through the safety barriers of the cathedral's entrance gives off the visualization of waves on water. "A large turnout, Master. Please, tell me what's on your mind. It's too grim for them to know, and we can figure something out."
"It's exactly because of that, boy, that I must tell them. I am pondering how I'll make sure they'll take what I have to say as a call to arms, to bring them confidence, when in reality they should be afraid."
He looks to his squire.
"Are you certain?"
Saduj nodded, and Eidolon spoke.
Tiberius Sorin has returned.
Just that alone caused Saduj to drop back and grasp onto the banner, hoping what it stands for could help him regain his composure.
You are familiar with the Daijin Wars?
Yes, sir. It was before I was born, but we all learn about it. The Illuminator nodded.
And so, you know the threats he can pose. But I don't want you to be afraid, boy, even though I can see you shaking. Know that we have found him still licking the wounds we dealt with him. He isn't in a condition to threaten the wider picture.
The boy smiled. The shaking was gone, but his master held a finger up.
But he's now made his move, and it'll only get worse for us unless we act now. And so this sermon will be for that. We can do it together.
The squire responded with some nervous laughter. I just hope the speech you may go. I just hope it made up along the way goes well. We're here. The tram attached to the end of its rail, and the doors shot open for them both to leave. The room connected was not what you'd expect to be in such a monolithic cathedral. It was empty, only lit by one ceiling light, and no wider than a tank. No fancy pictures on the walls or paint, just one pad on the floor in the middle. Despite them both being the only ones in the room, their hearts began to beat louder and faster. Steeling himself, Saduj took the first steps to the pad banner held high, followed by his master. When both were on, ribbons of light sprung around them and electrical humming occurred and accompanied by a flash. They were teleported to the observation podium. The observation podium was at the front of the cathedral, overlooking the circular plaza that connected to the red-carpeted highway. Its view was a spectacle unto itself, but the eyes of the faithful were understandably transfixed to the newly arrived Illuminator and his squire. A cheer of joy and reverence, so loud it made sense that all attendees had worn earplugs that suppressed just enough noise to protect their eardrums from bursting, and the stained glass windows made from bulletproof material. The combined air pressure had ruffled the flames of many torches placed around the plaza and on the balcony. So many people, creating their own weather phenomena by their combined devotion to the Emperor's divinity. Imagine what their zealotry could bring about in a war. Behind Eidolon and Saduj were apostles, who stood to attention with their glaives. Hovering in front of the balcony were cameras. This, of course, was being televised to all corners of the Empire. Thousands of worlds, to be exact, across the vast oceans of stars called the Milky Way. Eidolon's heart had gained a sense of calm upon seeing the vast swarm of devotees, their fiery adoration, their hopes and dreams all ablaze, mightier than any bonfire and hotter than any star, all on display and ready to be directed towards a singular goal. Eidolon, simply raising his arms, had brought the entire 10-square-mile precipice of the Grand Cathedral to an abrupt and eerie silence. How one man could turn the attention and will of people with a mere wave. Extraordinary, Saduj thought to himself. Looking to all cameras, then fixating his gaze to a completely empty part of the ship's walls in front of him so he wouldn't be distracted, Eidolon begun his sermon.
My cherished believers, loved brothers and sisters, while I was meant to bring you more news of joy, today I had been brought tales, news of a grim event that I must share. You, my faithful, will be the first to hear these words. Not even my other generals know yet. Tiberius Soren has came out of hiding and...
His speech was cut off by the quaking, all-consuming cries of despair from the crowd. What was a calm gathering had now been transformed into a stampede, a mania. Acting quickly, Eidolon let loose his power. A blossoming white-gold ray of light encompassed the entire balcony. The cathedral reflected the light to all angles, showering those in the light of him. It worked, paving in the soft, calming heat of Eidolon's power of belief had brought them back into the fold. Now he had to make sure to keep them there.
I share your dread. My heart quaked when I first heard it. I so desperately pleaded it to be a tasteless bit of comedy. But no, it is the reality. I know that some of you here may have fought in the Daijin Wars yourselves, and the memories may be flooding your hearts with grief that no one should be burdened with.
He finally took his focus off the empty space and looked directly into the crowd. He leaned over the balcony with his hands firmly grasping the marble barriers.
So should we just give in to it? Are we not hardened by our collective faith in Emperor Melitian? Above all else, we all but cowards?
The crowd roared a very resounding no.
And that I had no doubt. You are all made of the same stuff that the Emperor is, the same type of matter, in the same universe. That is enough to have a piece of his godliness. It's enough you know love, peace, and duty to your fellow man, woman, and child.
His speech became less of a presentation and more from the heart. Forgetting the words he had pre-planned, convincing himself that he must be true to himself. For how would they be trustful of him otherwise?
And so, we should not relent, my family. Nay, it must be the opposite. We should rejoice, for he does not return with armies at his beck and call, or fashioned with his might, arms, and armour. No one has returned as nothing but a man who refused to accept his time was over. Determination that is more deserving to the likes of you all. Of course it's dreadful. We're smart enough to understand that we can fear. It's what motivates us to chase the ideals we set ourselves, no matter how unreachable they may be. It is the effort that counts.
The crowd begins to stir in a cheer, but they quieten down when Eidolon once again raises his hand to pause them.
My sermon is no longer so. It is now a call to arms, a call to volunteers, for service, and above all else, the divine mission that has been brought before us by the Emperor himself, to prove we are the faithful, to carry out the long overdue execution of Tiberius Soren, with us at its helm.
The crowd erupts into a roar, calling for war, for bloodshed, and for justice.
Take this task likely not. It will require all that you are, and to surpass it. You have already done a great effort to not allow his influence to paralyze you, with the fear he so grievously wielded against us before. We're stronger already. Now we must push forward, my faithful. Ready your arms. we liberate our loyalist brothers from their embarrassment to deal with him and avenge those that we have lost. Go forth with strength and faith. The stars are ours by conviction. The lives of the faithless, ours to take.
Sadouche couldn't take it and threw the banner way high up above. The altitude blew its flag over Eidolon, painting him in the likeness of a conquering hero, and the people below revered him as such. The plaza bustled with conversation and shouts of brotherhood in arms. He had done it. Already he had turned the fear that accompanied the knowledge of Tiberius into a rallying cry for justice. Stepping off the podium and followed by his apostles, he leaves Sadouche to revel in the admiration and the joy of the moment. For what was to follow would be nothing but duty, war, and violence on a monumental scale. And beyond, should they arrive too late. The ship's destination, formerly the capital world, now changed to the Trappist system. From the observational window above, ships of a lesser size, but still monumental, numbered over 100, followed in the pasture of Serenity's wake. The time is now, and never will it be again. For the sake of the Orion Empire and its faithful, Tiberius must not be allowed to rise from the ashes he crawled from. And with that, the chapter is complete. Join in next time as the crusade begins.